So I came first to this area at Portage and met some of the brethren there, and then to Griffith and Highland, and eventually to Woodmar, and then Hessville. And it's a wonderful thing when you go into a certain part of the country that you recognize there are several sound and faithful congregations to God, and that there are many people that live in the area that are seeking to do His will. And this congregation has a rich history and heritage, and we're just so thankful that so many of you are a part of this labor here, and we're thankful that we could have a part in being with you this week and doing what we can to think about some of the things that were taught by our Savior. We're calling this series The Hard Sayings of Jesus, because many of the things that Jesus taught are very difficult. Certainly that was the language that was used by the people that heard Jesus in John chapter 6. This is a hard saying. Who can hear it, they asked. And this morning we talked about the fact that in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus certainly had things to say that astonished the people that heard them. You know, it says at the very end of the Sermon on the Mount, at the end of chapter 7, that when Jesus finished His teaching, the multitudes were astonished because He taught them as one having authority and not as their scribes. When I finish teaching, people are exhausted. But whenever Jesus finished teaching, the multitudes were astonished. I can say to you tonight that you will be astonished to once again consider things you've read and heard before in the gospel account of Jesus' sermon. We'll only be looking at a brief portion of the text in Matthew chapter 5, but we will be particularly noting those things that Jesus said in contrast to what the people had heard and what they had believed, what they had been taught. It is not so much that Jesus was teaching something different than the law of Moses. I think that we could say more correctly that He was correcting their impressions of what the law of Moses said, and certainly what they had been taught by the scribes and Pharisees. And everything that we're noticing tonight and in the nights to come are predicated upon that statement Jesus made in verse 20. Except your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter into the kingdom of heaven. It will help you if you will keep in mind during each of these lessons that when Jesus made reference to, you have heard that it hath been said, that this is predominantly the things that scribes and Pharisees taught. This was what they believed, this was what they had taught the people, this was what the people had heard all of their lives. And then Jesus says, but I say unto you. And we're noticing that the things that Jesus said are much more demanding. And we need to give attention to those things because, as our Savior said, unless we do better than the scribes and Pharisees, we cannot hope to enter into the kingdom and into the joys of heaven. I wanted to just mention briefly the schedule for these lessons. On Monday night, tomorrow night, we'll be talking about lust and adultery in the heart, as Jesus talks about that right after this text that has been read in your hearing tonight. Then on Tuesday night, we'll be talking about the subject of divorce and remarriage, probably one of the most controversial subjects that could be preached about or talked about today. Even so far as our own brethren are concerned, there are so many different views and different practices about divorce and remarriage. But we can rest assured that what Jesus tells us is indeed the intent that God had when He gave us His law. On Wednesday night, oaths and swearing and profanity. And then on Thursday night, taking vengeance, striking back, going the extra mile, giving to those that ask of us and those that would borrow from us. And then finally, the last lesson on Friday night about love. And particularly where Jesus says that we must love our enemies. Not just love our neighbor, but love our enemies. And do everything that we can to bless their lives, pray for them, and do good to those that despitefully use us. So I hope that mentioning those lessons will encourage you to know where we are going. You can look ahead in your text and more or less determine by the words that I've shared with you tonight about how Jesus contrasted what the people had heard and what he intended that they know concerning the will of God. Well, in our text tonight, we're certainly talking about the idea of anger. Jesus mentions murder right at the very beginning, but what he has in mind is not so much the actual taking of a life as it is the thought in the heart that makes one guilty in the sight of God of such a sin that is as weighty and serious as murdering. Jesus is saying in this text, "You've heard that it hath been said, or it was said to those of old, you shall not murder." But notice he says, that I say unto you, even if you are angry with your brother, you may have committed murder in your heart already. Well, this is a first in a series of statements in which Jesus makes the requirement of the law more radical than the strict letter of the law might seem to indicate. So Jesus quotes on this occasion from the 6th commandment in verse 21 and says, "You've heard that it hath been said, not commit murder. But I say to you," and then we note that similar language throughout the rest of this context as Jesus gives them the hard saying. The hard saying is what Jesus says after the words, "But I say unto you." Murder was a capital offense under the Mosaic law. Anyone that committed murder committed a capital crime and was sentenced to death by stoning in that day and time. Jesus points out that the murderous act often springs from an angry heart, just like adultery springs from a lustful heart in verses 27 through 30. And so it's in the mind that the crime is first committed and that judgment is incurred. It is whenever we begin to think about someone in a murderous way that we are guilty in the sight of God. Not if we just take action upon that hateful feeling, but already we're in danger of the judgment of God just by hating and by being angry with our brother. An earthly court cannot take action, of course, against an angry thought. Neither can it take action against a lustful thought in the hearts of men. But God's heavenly court can and certainly does. And this is why this is such a hard saying to so many people. Jesus is saying that God is concerned not just about the outward actions of an individual, but he is concerned about the inward attitudes as well as the actions of our lives. And so the inward thoughts from which these actions proceed, Jesus says, is what we need to concern ourselves with. You might notice in verse 22, there is a phrase. I'm looking at the New King James Version tonight, and you may have a similar translation that Jesus says, "But I say unto you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause." I want you to notice those words, "without a cause." This is a later addition to the Greek text, and I believe that it was added because someone designed it to make Jesus' words more tolerable. You know, the other man's anger may be sheer bad temper, but mine is always righteous indignation. We always want to defend our anger by saying, "I have a just cause." My anger is righteous indignation. And so we try to justify becoming angry many times whenever there's no justification, no excuse whatsoever for the kind of outburst that we make on occasion. But Jesus' original words make no such distinction here. Anyone who is angry with his brother exposes himself to the judgment of God. There is no telling where unchecked anger may lead. Let me share with you two other passages in the New Testament that I think certainly address what Jesus is speaking of here. The first one in the writing of the Apostle Paul in Ephesians 4 and verse 26. Paul says, "Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down upon your wrath, neither give place to the devil." So what we have to understand is that whenever we have anger, many times we allow the devil to take over in using that kind of emotion and feeling and the actions that erupt as a result of that anger. It is certainly not God that we are serving, but the devil. So don't give in and allow the devil to work in your life, Paul is saying. Be angry and do not sin. How can we be angry and not sin? By not saying things that would be sinful, by not thinking things that would be sinful, and by not doing things that would be sinful in the sight of God. The very best illustrations are our Savior as He cleansed the temple, both in John chapter 2 and Matthew chapter 21. Here's an angry man who is upset that they have turned a place of worship and service into a house of merchandise or a den of thieves. Or we might say that in the denouncement Jesus made of the scribes and Pharisees that we studied this morning, in Matthew 23, we see an angry Jesus. There's no other way we can take His words whenever He calls these people hypocrites and pronounces woes upon them and asks them, how shall you escape the damnation of hell? Jesus is angry. He's fit to be tied, as we sometimes say. But what He says is right. What He says is fair. What He says is needful. And He does not take some action that would cause Him to sin and do wrong in the sight of God. What He has said will help these people if they will only hear and turn from the evil of their way. So be angry and do not sin, and neither give place to the devil. James, in James chapter 1, verses 19 through 20, said, let every man be slow to wrath. Slow to speak, slow to anger or wrath, swift to listen. You know, you should be twice as slow as you are fast. I have to slow myself down once in a while and remind myself of that. Being fast is good in some things, but being slow in regard to anger and sin, and being slow in regard to listening and hearing what others say, those things are so very important. And so be slow to wrath. Why? Because He says the wrath of man does not work the righteousness of God. The wrath of Jesus worked the righteousness of God. But how many times can I say, when I get angry, it is done the will of God? How many times can you defend your anger and the action that your anger leads to by saying, what I am doing is the will of God and getting angry? It is very, very unusual for us to be able to defend ourselves in that regard. And so what we need to understand is that wrath usually is doing the devil's bidding and not the Savior's bidding. God and Jesus have a right to be angry because they do not sin. But man needs to be more careful. Seldom can he control his anger to the point that he does not sin as a result of that. Well, what Jesus is telling us is what God intended under His law, and certainly what He's pointing to in the coming of the new covenant that He will establish. He is saying that the thought of the heart is just as important as the deeds that are done resulting from it. God will judge us for any thoughts as well as for our words. And later in verse 22, he talks about how anger can cause us to use words that will incur the judgment and wrath of God. It is not just our actions, but it is our thoughts and our words that we must be careful about. Righteousness and unrighteousness is viewed by God not just as the actual deeds that we do, but in our thoughts and our words as well. This morning we talked about how righteousness is a state of heart. And when our heart is right with God, when Jesus has remade our hearts, then we will indeed live the righteous life that God intends. But if our heart is not right and our thoughts are not right, then certainly we cannot be righteous in the sight of God. You will notice in verse 22 there seems to be an ascending order to things that are mentioned here about the result of anger. First of all, he says that we'll be in danger of the judgment, and I believe that's talking about under the old law. Because of what the law said, People who would lose their temper and be angry with their brother might take further actions, and they are going to be accountable unto God, unto God's law.